G'day mate, 40 here. Just took 3 days off from streaming because I've been under the weather. It's good to take a pause, reassess. When you have no strength or energy, you carefully evaluate, what's worth putting a little bit of effort into. And I did not come to any stunning revelations during my 3 days on the sick bed. I have been listening to an Audible book called The Most Powerful Court in the World. It's by UCLA law professor Stuart Benner. And about 3/4 of the way through the book, he doesn't seem to make any effort whatsoever to develop the case that the United States Supreme Court is the most powerful court in the world. I'm wondering off the top of my head if the Israeli Supreme Court is the most powerful court in the world. The appointees are not picked by politicians. Every governing coalition in the Israeli parliament has to have an independently selected attorney general. And so the Israeli legal system, in particular the Israeli Supreme Court, can invalidate any piece of legislation passed by Parliament on the basis that it thinks it's unreasonable, which is incredibly wide latitude. But compared to all the other major nations in the world, the United States Supreme Court is by far the most powerful. And compared to every other major nation in the world, the United States Senate is the most powerful upper house in the world. So in most parliamentary democracies in the Westminster system, people vote for a political party. They go to the polls and that party selects a leader. And if the party is able to form a government, a majority of the seats, then it can pretty much do what it wants. There are very few restrictions on a governing majority in Australia, England, Canada. There's no equivalent Supreme Court to invalidate legislation. Even its versions of the Federal Reserve are not as independent. So the US political system is different in that its federalism is far more committed than any other political system of which I'm aware. Right? There's far more variety in how government and law is carried out in the 50 American states compared to different states in Australia and compared to other federal systems. Like the difference between Arkansas and Georgia and New York, Massachusetts, California, just all over the map. So the US government system has an incredible commitment to federalism, meaning states' rights. It's unlike any other major power of which I'm aware. It has an upper house with more power than any other upper house. The US Senate is a co-equal part of the Congress along with the House of Representatives. And in pretty much every other major country, the upper house has only limited influence. So in pretty much every other major democracy of which I'm aware, right, you assemble a government with a majority, you can do pretty much anything you want. You can pass tax cuts, spending cuts, right? And it is almost always unacceptable to vote against the party. But in America, power is incredibly spread out. So Donald Trump has to deal with about 30 rebellious Republicans in the House of Representatives. For many decades, you had conservative Southern Democrats who would usually vote with Republicans on many issues. The Supreme Court striking down legislation as unconstitutional. You don't have that in any other major governing system. So this is an excellent, pretty even-handed history of the United States Supreme Court. It's interesting from its very beginnings. There were all these arguments and criticisms that the Supreme Court was politicized. So the same rhetoric and criticism that the Supreme Court has become politicized that you hear today, right, that's echoed from the first days of the US Supreme Court. And it's fascinating how when the court has overstepped its authority, it has sparked a major backlash. So abortion was not a primary issue for conservatives or for Christians until Roe v. Wade in 1973. And then that became a rallying cry for those opposed to liberalism. It constituted the cement around which conservative governance held together, held all parts of the non-liberal coalition together. And then in 1960s, the US Supreme Court invalidated the death penalty. And there was a major backlash to that. So support for the death penalty dramatically increased after this US Supreme Court invalidated it. The day that the Supreme Court ruling came out, 5 states introduced legislation to make the death penalty statutory, meaning a Congress-approved, State House-approved legislation. And the Supreme Court ruling invalidating death penalty, right, instigated a massive backlash in support of the death penalty that was not there prior to the ruling. So people often engage in what Tom Sowell thinks is stage one thinking. All right, they go, oh, let's take a step towards what we believe in, and then we'll take a second step. But usually, after you take that first step, there's a response, right? Your battle plans have to change once you get punched in the face. So, enormous response to the most significant judge-made law. So, judges, in theory, are supposed to just interpret the law, not make the law. But when judges essentially invented the law about Miranda rights, I think around 1963, right, that sparked a massive backlash promoting tougher law enforcement. And Brown versus the Board of Education, perhaps the most famous Supreme Court ruling of the past 80 years, desegregating schools. Right, the justices couldn't find any legal basis for their ruling. So they just made up this short brief aimed at the general public, not looking for legal precedent. Right? They felt something to be true. And so, kind of like Oberfell, Judge Kennedy's majority opinion making gay marriage the law of the land, couldn't find legal basis for it, but they felt so strongly that they just overflowed with emotion in their ruling and didn't bother trying to make a strong case in law. Happy January 6th. So I want to give the Democrats credit for being better sports, accepting this election result than Republicans were 4 years ago on January 6th. During World War II, it's interesting that the increasingly liberal left-wing US Supreme Court during World War II almost always sided with the government and sided with the military. So in a time of war, right, people who would otherwise vote in a more left-wing and liberal direction completely changed to side with the military, side with the government. And you saw the same thing with Democratic Party politicians after 9/11. They pretty much got behind the 2003 invasion of Iraq, 2002 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, and allowing for massive government surveillance through the Patriot Act. So one thing that this book by Stuart Banner reinforces, called The Most Powerful Court in the World, is the power of the situation. So certain situations, even the most left-wing Supreme Court justices will side with the US military and with government demands, for example, for putting Japanese Americans in internment camps. And then you also get a sense of how power is distributed in the United States. That it's not like most first world democracies where power essentially resides with a cabinet of a governing coalition or a governing party. You can pretty much do anything at once. But in the United States, power is widely spread out, which on the one hand can encourage corruption and dysfunction. So the US government looks much messier than the way government operates in England, Germany, Australia, Japan. It's much wilder here. And it seems much less eloquent, much less elevated, much less intelligent. Right? Your average member of the House of Representatives seems to be about a standard IQ below a member of Parliament in Great Britain. But that higher IQ in Great Britain hasn't necessarily translated into superior governance. And I don't have an argument which style of governance is better, the American or the British system. But it's something much wilder, woollier, messier, more awkward in the United States compared to the parliamentary system. And when you read this history of the Supreme Court, you see how the excesses of one ideological tendency lead to a backlash. So the Supreme Court was consistently moving in a leftward direction from the late 1930s till about 1972, 73. And then the court's been erratically moving in a more rightward direction since then. Now there's a solid right-wing majority. But on the other hand, the current US Supreme Court does not enjoy high approval ratings. So I may not be seeing it now, but the current US Supreme Court may well be setting up a backlash towards the left. It's interesting how during World War II, the Los Angeles Times, now a left-wing newspaper, editorialized that you shouldn't talk about the civil rights of enemy aliens or aliens, people who have no right to be in the country. So if you're not a citizen in the United States, you don't exactly enjoy any rights. And that used to be much more clear in elite circles than it's become over the last 50 years. So it used to be that human rights were predominantly a conservative program in the 1950s, a way to set limits on the excesses of socialist government post-World War II in Western Europe. And then since the 60s, human rights has increasingly become a left-wing domain. Talk to you guys later. The penumbra of the Luke Ford channel only legalizes love and radical inclusion. Yeah, Justin Trudeau resigned. So he lasted a long time. But what did he accomplish? Like, how is Canada better off? How is Canada stronger? because he was prime minister. So you can serve in office as prime minister for a long time and not make much of a positive contribution to your country. While Donald Trump is perhaps an incredibly influential politician with his full second term yet to go. So Donald Trump, unlike Justin Trudeau, is willing to take on the pieties of the ruling elite. And Justin Trudeau is essentially the embodiment of the pieties of the Canadian ruling elite. When I was going to bed last night, I was looking forward to getting up this morning so I could enjoy the return of Mark Halperin's morning meeting. And they all agreed that Donald Trump's had a good 30 days. And it's hard at this point to say which of his nominees is most likely to be rejected from the cabinet. So the terror attack in New Orleans, Trump's effectiveness under the rule of Susie Wiles, his power to get Mike Johnson re-elected as Speaker of the House. And even though many of Trump's cabinet nominees seem outrageous, and I can't stand his health nominees from Bobby Kennedy to many of the others, I think are terrible picks. But he's looking pretty strong right now, perhaps in large part in compensation to how increasingly unpopular Joe Biden is. Talk to you blokes later. Bye-bye.